We are live.
Good evening. I'm Christina Kennedy, the Vice Chair, and I'm standing in for our Chair, Rebecca Call, on tonight's meeting. Welcome to a virtual meeting of the City of Dublin Planning and Zoning Commission. The Ohio Legislature passed several emergency laws to address the pandemic, including the ability for public entities to conduct virtual meetings. We are currently holding our meetings online and live streaming to YouTube until further notice. You can access the live stream on the city's website. We welcome your comments on cases. In order to submit any questions or comments during the meeting, please use the form under the streaming video on the city's website. Your questions and comments will be relayed to the commission by the meeting moderator. Please provide a valid name and address when submitting your comments, and please refrain from making any inappropriate comments. We want to accommodate public participation as much as possible, and we encourage that. So with that, we'll start off our meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance. So we will turn our cameras off, and fellow commissioners, if you could please turn your volume on. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands,
one nation,
under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, Ms. Beal, will you please call roll?
Yes, Mr. Schneier.
Here.
Ms. Fox.
Here.
Mr. Grimes.
Here.
Mr. Supelak.
Here.
Mr. Fishman.
Here.
Ms. Kennedy.
Here. All right, we'll start with acceptance of documents and approval of minutes. So I'm looking for a motion to accept the documents into the record and approve the minutes from February 4th, 2021. Do I have a motion?
So moved. Second.
Thank you, Mr. Fishman. Mr. Grimes, please call roll.
Mr. Fishman.
Yes.
Mr. Supelak.
Yes.
Ms. Kennedy.
Yes.
Ms. Fox.
Yes.
Mr. Schneier.
Yes.
Mr. Grimes.
Yes.
Thank you. The Planning and Zoning Commission is an advisory board to City Council when rezoning and platting of property are under consideration. In such cases, City Council will receive recommendations from the Commission. In other cases, the Commission has the final decision-making responsibility. Anyone who intends to address the Commission on any of these administrative cases must be sworn in. The agenda is typically determined at the beginning of the meeting by the chair. The rules and regulations of the Planning and Zoning Commission state that no new cases can be introduced after 10:30 p.m. We do have one case eligible for the consent agenda this evening. That case is Case 2, Bridge Street District, Amended Final Development Plan Code Amendments. Do any of my fellow commissioners wish to pull this from the consent agenda? I don't see any yeses on that request, so we'll keep it on the consent agenda and we will start with that item tonight. So next, moving on to the swearing in of witnesses and staff. Anyone intending to address the commission on any cases this evening, please turn your camera on and raise your right hand. Thank you. And answer in the affirmative. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in your testimony to this commission?
Yes.
Thank you. All right, so we'll start with our item from the consent agenda. This is the Bridge Street District Amended Final Development Plan. It's case number 20177 ADMC. It's an administrative request for code amendment. This application is for a review and recommendation to City Council to amend the zoning code section 153.066 to add an amended final development plan review process for the Bridge Street District in alignment with other review processes. Staff, has any public comment been submitted for this item?
No public comment, thank you.
In that case, we'll move on, looking for a motion to recommend approval to City Council for the addition of an amended final development plan review process for the Bridge Street District.
So move.
Thank you, Mr. Grimes. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second, thank you.
Ms. Fox,
Yes.
Mr. Schneier,
Yes.
Mr. Grimes,
Yes.
Ms. Kennedy,
Yes.
Mr. Fishman, Mr. Supalack.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Beal. I know there was some chit chat with the commission earlier about the hard work and efforts that the staff had put into that previous case. So on behalf of the commission, we thank you for your efforts to move that forward. So we'll move on to our next case. We'll be discussing the historic design guidelines. This is case 180037ADMC. This application is for a review and recommendation to City Council for new historic design guidelines applicable to properties located within Architectural Review District and its outlying historic properties. Our case presentation tonight is by Ms. Martin. We will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Good evening. Just give me a moment to pull my presentation up. So as the chair had mentioned, this is an administrative request for a recommendation of approval to City Council. Once forwarded to City Council, this item would be for their consideration as a resolution. So a bit of case history. As you may have noticed, the case number for this application is from 2018. This is a long-standing special project that staff, the community, and our boards and commissions have been steadily working on. So in 2018, this project all began with a Historic Dublin Stakeholder Committee. This committee was comprised of residents, business owners, as well as property owners in the district. And this committee identified opportunities for revisions to the existing guidelines, which had been in place for a significant amount of time. In 2019, staff engaged the public at 2 public meetings, both held at the Dublin Community Church. Staff also held 4 office hour sessions every Wednesday in August of 2019 for folks to ask one-on-one questions and discuss the revisions with staff. In 2019, the Planning and Zoning Commission reviewed this proposal twice. And in 2019, the Architecture Review Board reviewed this proposal 3 times. In 2020, staff continued to make the revisions and tweaks based on public comment as well as board and commission input. In 2020, the Architecture Review Board reviewed this 3 times. And in February of 2021, the Architecture Review Board recommended approval of the Historic Dublin Design Guidelines to the Planning and Zoning Commission. So we are before you this evening with an overview, since it has been a while since you've last seen this. And we are happy to talk through any items that you have questions on. We're looking for any final modifications or tweaks that you would like to pass on to City Council. So this proposed resolution is in tandem with 2 ordinances that were just before City Council at their last meeting. City Council approved an ordinance for a code amendment, which also modified the boundary of Historic Dublin, which you can see here on the screen. The boundary of Historic Dublin would be the geography of applicability for these design guidelines, as well as any outlying historic properties and farmsteads that are listed on Appendix V within the City of Dublin zoning code that might fall outside of that Architecture Review District. Additionally, Ordinance 4-21, which was an area rezoning, was also considered and approved by City Council. This area rezoning was to remove historic Dublin from the Bridge Street district. The intent here was to provide greater regulatory separation between those two districts, and then to also provide this opportunity to right-size regulations to the small historic walkable nature of that district, as well as to update the guidelines in conjunction with that. So one of the primary goals and objectives of all three of these projects is really to ensure that the documents reflect community values of today, as well as to ensure they are as user-friendly as possible. So a brief overview of the guidelines and what is contained herein. The first three chapters of the guidelines really set the stage for chapters 4 through 7, which are the guidelines that are to be used in conjunction with the code. And the main differentiator between code and guidelines is the difference between the word shall. Shall is a code and it shall comply, and should is a guideline and maybe a best practice and maybe one recommendation on how to successfully apply the zoning code regulations, which is why it was so important for these documents to be updated with one another. So a bit of detail, as mentioned, chapters 1 through 3 provide an introduction, set the context and character for the district, including the natural features, the unique neighborhood character, as well as identifying building types and predominant architectural styles in historic Dublin. And then there is also a user guide. So in these chapters, you will find historic photography of Dublin, as well as on the right-hand side of your screen, the building type, which is the form, and then the architectural style, which are really the details of that building. And this is intended to inform residents, staff, as well as board members as new folks join the board. So chapter 4 focuses on rehabilitation. Rehabilitation and new construction are two separate sections of the guidelines, and these focus on a variety of topics. With rehabilitation, preservation is always the strongest recommendation, with lesser opportunities for modifications. And the real intent there is to ensure that the historic vernacular character we do have in Dublin is retained in the short and long term. So chapter 5 focuses on new construction and particularly infill development. While infill is certainly not the primary goal or objective of the code amendments or the guidelines, it does provide guidance for targeted, context-sensitive infill development. This schematic shows an example of what residential infill development may look like, although all the schematics within the guidelines are intended only to provide one potential outcome, recognizing that designers have a multitude of directions that they may pursue in order to meet the code requirements while also balancing the intent of the guidelines. So this section covers items like building placement, so siting on the lot, the form and mass of the new structure, the width and setbacks of the building, facade treatments, as well as architectural details and sustainability of new structures. The final two chapters of the design guidelines are site design as well as signs. Site design covers areas including parking, landscaping, fences, and historic stone walls. The sign section is intended to be administered in conjunction with the sign code. Particular areas of note are the color and relief section, materials and lighting, as well as the encouragement to ensure signs are sensitive to their surrounding context, as well as the quality and character of historic Dublin, which, as we all know, is unique from the rest of the Bridge Street district. So with that, staff is recommending approval to the Planning and Zoning Commission, as is the Architecture Review Board, for Council's potential consideration at their March 22nd, 2021 meeting. With that, I would be happy to answer any questions or walk through any sections of the design guidelines with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Martin, for the presentation. Any questions from the commission to start us off tonight? Mr. Schneier.
I actually have a few. I'll try to be organized and brief, even though this has been going on for some time. There's just some of it might be wordsmithing, some of it might be more important. And I would just throw them out there for consideration, even though this has been through lots of iterations. There's 5.0, which is on page 46, new construction. There's a preamble, section A. It's, new construction should be differentiated from existing buildings, but should be compatible with the established character of the district. I just have, since I got involved in this, been troubled by that language, that it can be read in, lots of different ways. Anybody's point of view can hang a hat on that, which may be good, may be bad. I really think it. I mean, I just if it isn't changed, I suggest it be struck, because I think it's confusing and it doesn't add value. It's just confusing. And the same in C. New construction should be similar to existing buildings, but new buildings should obviously be new to the observer. I mean, I'll defer to Mark and others with expertise, but that doesn't sound like a guideline to me. It sounds difficult to follow it. Then these are, I'm taking them in order, even though they're a little bit all over the place. Something that was so on page 48, doors and windows, 5.6b, we talk about the window to wall ratio should be similar to other buildings in the district. Straightforward enough. But then you go to the next page, 49, 5.11a, buildings should maximize window design to provide daylight. I get that, that's under the new energy efficiency sustainability, you want more windows, but those, again, would seemingly be incompatible, because if you maximize window design, you pretty much might run afoul of the window to wall ratios on the preceding page. And then finally, page 52, the applicability, it's about landscape, among others, but specifically about landscape. And the applicability says are applicable to both residential and commercial properties, except as were otherwise noted. And then there's section 6.3, which talks about landscaping, but the code, it's 153.173C3, says the Architecture Review Board it has no jurisdiction over residential landscaping. So that one could just be, these are all mine. That could be tightened up, even though it says except where otherwise noted. Well, it's not noted in the guidelines, it's in the code. So, a sentence or just some independent clause or something that specifies that. So, a couple nits, and then one that's just a bit more open-ended with respect to sort of this old versus new. And those are my comments.
Nikki, do you want to address those one by one? Do you want to make a response to each of those specifically, or do you want us to keep going with questions and then bring them all together?
I would defer to you. I mean, I would be happy to address them one by one so that we don't get our list too long, I guess.
Let's do that if that's
Okay.
okay with the commission. Let's go through those one by one.
Okay, so I'm going to do them in reverse order. We were on page 52, site design, and in regards to the site design standards being applicable to residential and commercial properties, Mr. Schneier is correct that in the code, residential property landscaping is not under the purview of the Architecture Review Board. However, it was the intent that section 6.3 landscaping would be recommendations for both residential and commercial properties. So potentially there would be an opportunity to clarify that. The reason that that was intended, at least by the Architecture Review Board, to be a recommendation for residential and commercial properties is specifically in regards to tree preservation. So the Architecture Review Board has no latitude on residential properties to require that trees be preserved. However, it is the desire of the Architecture Review Board to encourage residential property owners to preserve trees wherever possible in order to maintain that kind of cultural landscape that's established there. So I do agree that it is potentially confusing and on the surface does not align. So potentially, we could clarify that if that's agreeable.
I think it would be a good idea because it appears as if residential landscaping is something that would be under consideration, and you might force or an applicant might expect that they would have to come with a landscape design when it isn't necessary. So there might be some sentence there that these, even though residential landscaping isn't, under the Architecture Review Board's purview, whatever, that these are recommendations for landscaping within the historic district. Something like that. I think that's important because it is confusing.
Definitely, we can certainly do that. So then, if we move back to pages 48 and 49, where we discuss doors and windows in section 5.6 and energy efficiency and sustainability in 5.11, I do believe that Mr. Schneier raises a good point. If the intent here was to allow for some flexibility, recognizing that new construction projects would want to employ, energy efficient and sustainable building methods, while also trying to balance that it really needs to be sensitive to the surrounding and established character, and not wanting an all glass structure or an all glass wall, particularly facing a public street. Potentially if that was to the rear of the home, maybe it would be acceptable. So I guess my recommendation would be to retain the items in 5.6, doors and windows, and to modify and or eliminate the recommendations in 5.11. Because the intent of the guidelines is to prioritize architectural character. And while there are opportunities for energy efficiency and sustainability, I would be reserved about prioritizing that over the established character.
Can I ask you a question about that, Nikki? Windows are probably one of the biggest things that come up with architecture review boards. So let me beta test this. I want to replace a window in a historic house that has original muttons that are true divides. Okay, I'm not going to replace it where they don't have to replace it with a wood single paned window that's a true divide. Where in this guideline do we know what they can replace it with?
Yeah, so what you would be referencing is in the rehabilitation section. So that would be on page 40.
Okay.
So outside the scope of new construction.
Okay.
And
so it does address it. I mean, if it does, that's great. If it does specify.
yes, so it says 4.8D, replacement windows should match the appearance of historic originals in number of panes, dimensions of sash members, and profile of sash members and muntins. Windows should simulate the operating characteristics as originals, but the implication is that they would not have to be original.
Okay, that's fine. That's great. I think it's worth the beta test sometimes on some of these things that come up all the time, right?
Absolutely. So I guess, Mr. Schneier, I would look for some additional direction from you regarding the new construction windows and where you fall between sustainability and character.
You know, I guess I'm just a purist when it comes to syntax. And, you know, yes, I have points of view as to what it should say, but in many cases, I'm more concerned about how it says it. So when I see, you know, language conflicts, it just sort of feels lawyer in me. If there's a way to reconcile them, I'm not sure, you know, what energy efficiency and sustainability. I'm not sure that windows are always that energy efficient compared to other services. So I'm not really sure why it's even in there. I get the other 2 points, but if the way you want to address it is choose one over the other, I guess I don't have a strong feeling on the substance. I just have a stronger feeling on the language, on the verbiage.
Okay, great. Thank you. And so then moving back to page 46 under section 5.1, I would be inclined to agree with Mr. Schneier in regard to A. I believe that something similar is said in a more direct manner in both B and C. So having the more general statement would be not necessary.
You know, I can
agree
make,
with that.
yeah, I can make a recommendation. The Lancaster, Ohio historic guidelines do go pretty far forward on exactly what Lance is talking about. And so if we're looking for, I think you're looking, Lance, aren't you looking for more definition about what you're expected to, the direction you're expected to go with new construction and complementing the historic district? Is that where I want to be clear what you're asking.
Yeah, that is it. So that everybody, regardless of what position the commission or an applicant may take, they both, could point to this and say, see, it fits, or see, it doesn't fit. And it ought not be both. It ought not be that arbitrary, capricious, or certainly arbitrary. So, Jane, if there's some language that somebody else has crafted that might be instructive, that'd be great.
There is. Let me read these couple paragraphs, if you don't mind, and see if it touches on what you're talking about. And this is about new construction solely. For the purpose of these guidelines, New construction includes new primary buildings such as houses and commercial buildings, as well as secondary buildings like garages being built within the context of the historic district. These guidelines also pertain to new additions to historic buildings. As owners and designers of buildings and additions in the historic district, you have a responsibility to design and build new in a manner which complements and respects the historic components. The design, density, and placement of new construction should respect the overall character of the site. Attention should be paid to the overall context, including the massing, size, scale, shape, materials, setbacks, spacing, fenestration, and design components of existing buildings in the vicinity of the site for the new construction. Design components include features such as porches, dormers, building symmetry, and roof pitch. New structures should look new, but also take design cues from existing buildings so as to relate to the historic setting. One should not attempt to replicate or mimic the historic buildings, but work to achieve compatibility. It is a challenging design task to strike this balance of honesty of new and respect of old. Be willing to consider multiple alternatives. I think the very last is, when considering addition to a historic building, study the appropriateness of the existing building for an addition, and some styles and types of buildings are more fitting for addition than others. Does that come anywhere close to?
Well, I like most of it because it provides, greater context. I think it was the next to last sentence sounds almost like the sentence that sort of troubles me. That it should look new, but it should be old. And it just, the Supreme Court definition of obscenity. We know when we see it. We all know it when we see it. But I guess it just, like in a perfect world, it's not code. I recognize that they're guidelines, so they're not as prescriptive. But just some way to reconcile the conflict, and maybe maybe the way is not to have these concepts in the same sentence. Yes, it should look old,
Right.
But we want it. It should be new, but we want it to look old. It just. And I don't really want to. I don't feel appropriate to spend the whole commission's time on this particular hang up. But and if everyone determines it's good the way it is and the staff agrees with that, let's just move on. But that's just my comment.
I do think that the reason it keeps getting brought up is because the Secretary of Interior on their advice sheets specifically say, and this is their quote, "New additions, exterior alterations, or related new construction shall not destroy historic materials that characterize the property. The new work shall be differentiated from the old and shall be compatible with the massing." Wait a minute. I thought they would. There is a place in there. I thought that was the one. I'm sorry. That does talk about the fact that it should not mimic history. And it always gets put in every one of these historic design guidelines because the National Park Service has some sort of standard. But I agree with you. I think it's very confusing. But I know the Architecture Review Board talked about this a lot, Nikki, so maybe you can speak to it again.
Hey, well, Nikki,
Go ahead.
how about this? Respond first, because I might change the direction a little bit.
Okay. So Ms. Fox, and Mr. Schneier, the challenge here is, right, the Architectural Review Board exists exactly to address these impossible, problems that we're faced with. And the challenge here, right, is that you're trying to reconcile two competing interests. And oftentimes those are the types of conversations that cannot be successfully prescribed on paper, which is where, you know, the human element comes in. And we certainly don't want to be intentionally misleading or conflicting. However, recognizing that the recommendation could very well be to look new, but also incorporate elements that pay tribute to historic forms. So I will tell you, in our public engagement process, we did do a visual preference survey with the community. Visual preference survey is kind of, right, a spectrum of what type of development folks would like to see. You know, on one end of the spectrum, you have, you know, very modern, something like the Dublin branch of the Columbus Metropolitan Library. And then the other end of the spectrum, you have something more like the Starbucks building, something that really tries to emulate historic form. And so trying to, you know, get somewhere closer to emulating historic form without creating, you know, a falsehood. Some folks refer to it as Disneyland, right? You don't want to be stepping into a fictional place. So you want these buildings to be new, be a period of their time, but have design elements that are responsive to historic characters.
Can I ask you quick, Nikki? It is true that ARB really was leaning towards staying away from modern architecture. They intentionally wrote these 3 paragraphs to maintain a traditional architectural style. They intentionally wrote them for that reason. Is that right? I think that's important.
That's correct. So yes, based on public engagement, the foundational belief is that these encourage more traditional architectural characters and forms versus modern elements.
To circle back, did we go through all your items, Mr. Schneier? Were there others? I think, according to my list, I think we got them.
I believe so, yeah.
Okay. Other questions for Nikki? Yeah, Mr. Supalak.
I don't have a lot of questions. I think a lot of people have chewed on this. I think we're just fine tuning some points here, but I guess I'm going to write on the commentary on 5.6 and 5.11, which is the windows on one part and then the energy efficient on the other. I think so long as the energy efficient defers to 5.6, like 5.11 should defer to 5.6. I think it works. I think it just has to read that hierarchy and deference relative to these guidelines. Now, whether that's a standard that is legally binding in any way, shape, or form, I don't know. But I don't know that it needs to be that here. As much as first and foremost, we want to kind of generally match proportion of window to wall, and then within that, yeah, we should consider, like, there's still leeway in. Do I shutter in a thing here, or do I have an opening? Am I, you know what I mean, 2 inches larger or not? So I think it still bends that way, or I wonder, even still, does the building code kind of cover that anyways relative to the energy efficiency? Not looking for an answer, just seed planting. As long as one is deferential to the other, there's a primary.
Mr. Fishman?
Yeah, he asked almost exactly, but I just want to, are the windows are going to have to look like the traditional windows, I assume, even though they're energy efficient. Is that where we are now? So they're going to look like the old type windows with the buttons and so on, even though they're going to be energy efficient. Is that what I assume after going through all this on the windows?
That's correct, Mr. Fishman.
Okay, so you're going to have the buttons, and they're from the outside. Somebody's going to say that could be an old window, correct?
Correct.
Okay, that's pretty much. Mr. Subelak answered
So-
much better than I did, but
So to get to Mr. Schneer's, Mr. Supelak's, and Mr. Fishman's points, if 511A said something along the lines of, window fenestration is encouraged to be designed to maximize energy efficiency without sacrificing the design considerations of 5.6. Would that do the trick for everybody?
I see
I'll go
heads.
with that.
Yes. Yes, yes.
Okay.
Other questions for right now?
Just on windows, I just want to, because
Yeah.
because let's say 5.6A refers to should be proportional to the building facade and reflect the pattern of other buildings. We don't have to do something like historic buildings or historic buildings in the district, do we? I mean, we're not going, I know how this works, and Lance does too. There's a lot of new construction in the district. So what happens is they say, well, it happened over here on this new building. It's going to happen. Why won't you let me do it on mine? Do we have to define it to that point where we say in new construction to the pattern of other historic buildings? Because this is new construction. This is not rehabilitation. I'd be curious to see what staff thinks of that.
I would be supportive of that. I think it's clarifying. I have seen firsthand, Ms. Fox, what you're describing with various applicants taking cues from other projects. So I think it's good to provide additional clarity anytime we can.
I just don't want to unnecessarily, this is where it's fine line. You don't want to necessarily bind someone in new construction, but you also want to make sure that this is a tough one because it happens all the time. So I like to hear what you think.
In other sections here, it may just be in A, the words in the district should be added, because you just look through a couple of those other paragraphs, like 5.4A talks about similar to other buildings in the district. B says similar to other buildings in the district, but A just says other buildings and doesn't say in the district, and maybe just the addition of words in the district, which is, provides some linguistic symmetry. Would that work?
It's this one's difficult because in this Lancaster, they talk about don't rely on precedent. And in our district now, we don't have a lot of volume. We have a lot of new buildings, which is becoming almost equal to the amount of the historic buildings. So I guess the determination here is in new construction, if their intent was traditional architecture, then do you have to say the character of the historic district, the character of a period? I don't know the answer to this, but I understand how an applicant can be confused if they come and build new in the district because it's not clear what the expectations are because of what's been already built. So we have to be clear if we're going to make these easily applicable for a commissioner.
To me, I think the elephant in the room is that the architecture in the historic district is eclectic. There is a 1968 Bob Webb home on a slab on Riverview. Fine house. It's now officially over 50 years old. Is it historic? Would anyone want to see? I'm not maligning Bob Webb at all, but the the more suburban subdivision, 4-bedroom, family room kind of house, on Riverview or High Street? Probably not. Whether it's precedent or not, it's there. Now you come, somebody were to come say, I want to do that, because we have so many different styles in commercial as well. In that district, it's not German Village, it's not Savannah, and I think that's what adds to, personally, I think it adds to the interest level there. But there's a lot. Somebody could point to just about anything and say, look, it's historic. It's just like that one. So these are guidelines. I'm the one who's picking at it, but I do respect that it may, given the history, literally, it may be virtually impossible to provide that much clarity. Nikki, I'd like you to weigh in on that.
I think you've raised some really good points, and the district is certainly eclectic, and we do not have the same stock of the same style of building like many other historic districts, in Central Ohio or in Ohio or elsewhere, which leads to some of these challenges when administering guidelines, because the guidelines have to fit a broader range of buildings over a greater time period. So I think this really just returns to, this is the underlying reason that the Architectural Review Board has the charge that it does. I think we all recognize how challenging that charge is. So, I would recommend that if there is any agreement tonight on items that you would like to see tightened up, I would be certainly happy to make those changes. My understanding is that Ms. Fox is asking, are we okay with designs being similar to other new construction projects, or should new construction projects be similar to historic projects?
Well, as I look through here, what I see consistently is references to other buildings in the district, similar to other structures in the district, other buildings in the district. Almost everyone uses that sort of qualifier, except for some reason, except for 5.6A, which says other buildings. So for consistency's sake, if you modify A to include other buildings in the district, at least you're consistent. Now, whether that's the direction or not, I'm fine with that, but I'm not sure that everybody else would be.
So if we have, sorry, Mr. Grimes, I'll get right back to you. If we look down at section 5.7A, it calls out historic styles. If we say historic styles, does that then cover older constructions, newer constructions? If we simply refer to the style, what would the commission's take on that be, if we were to use that consistent terminology?
I'm not sure that it may just be one of those things that defy that much clarification. Yeah. Does it? I'm not sure that it fixes it necessarily, but
well, maybe we'll give it a minute to sink in and move over to Mr. Grimes. You had a comment or question?
Yes, I would say that what Mr. Schneer is driving at is a lot of resourced in what Nikki was saying, that we don't have a lot of depth of stock of any particular style. It is eclectic. We do have a mixture in there. So I would say that, you know, the more new projects mimic something within the district, whether it's more modern or more old, eventually you'll probably have a deeper stock in some forms that get adopted. So there aren't, while there are opportunities for replacement and additions and so forth, you know, this isn't an infinite amount of capacity. But I think this report, though, is a wonderful report, well put together, well organized set of guidelines. And I would think that it would help kind of stimulate the values that have been identified and an inspiration to people to read through that and kind of get a better understanding if they're one of those property owners that wants to either build new or add on or duplicate. So I would say these things are probably more likely just to work out by leaving, you know, it open enough for folks to apply their energy and they all want to improve the district regardless. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Mr. Grimes. Mr. Fishman. You're muted, Mr. Fishman.
I was saying that Lance could have appreciation for this because he lived in Muirfield for 35 years and I was on the design review board. And one thing that creates a nightmare is that people who violate the architectural design, we have a thing where they can come in and appeal their case when the association turned it down, and they will always bring pictures of another house that maybe slipped through or they had changed the windows and so on and say, I copied it from this house. And I think that the clause in there that says previous of other houses, I think maybe we need to fine tune that a little bit, because I think if you drive around the district, by the way, I agree with Leo that I think this is really well written. I was really excited when I read it, but I think that maybe should be tightened up. 2 things: the windows, I think we've covered that, but also technically, you drive around the district, there's some 1950s houses in there that have the big picture window in the front with the 2 windows on the side. I don't think we want to see that in something that looks that certainly doesn't look historic. So that phrase concerns me about, you know, copying those. Even though it is eclectic, I think if and you would know better than I, Jane, and people living in the district, that I think you want to emulate not the 1950s or the 1970s, but something from truly historical Dublin, which is something 100 years old. So that's just my input, just suggestion. I mean, do what you want, but I know that was a nightmare when I was on the design review committee. They bring something in and with a lawyer with them and saying, listen, we found 3 houses that had blue trim, you know, and so we want blue trim. So I think, you know, that's something to think about.
Mr. Boggs. Yep.
Sorry, I was just going to say to Mr. Fishman's point, and maybe in talking about this language and the concern of people pulling an example of something that wasn't done that well, trying to justify what they want to do. You know, maybe what we can revise the language to say is not just other buildings, period, and not just other buildings in the district, but other buildings in their immediate context or something to that effect. Because, you know, Mr. Fishman points out that there are 1950s homes that are in the historic district, but those may be next to other 1950s homes. I remember an application going through ARB where the question was whether and this was a rehab project, but the question was whether it was consistent with mid-century modern architecture of its contemporary houses on the block. And putting a South High Street design on that particular property in the historic district just wouldn't have worked. So maybe it's sort of narrowing it and having a recognition in there somewhere that every property is unique in context. And so application of so-called precedents is going to be very limited. And maybe just have it be a general header for the entire design guideline. So everybody knows going in, you can't rely on something 2 blocks down necessarily to get your way.
I second that motion. It is
Ramble.
good. You disarm that argument right out of the gate, right, with a clear clause that basically undermines it, right? So it is really, really effective.
Here's a suggestion. I don't know if we can pull it right out of there, but we can play around with it. New structures should look new, but also take design cues from surrounding existing buildings so as to relate to the historic setting. One should not attempt to replicate or mimic the historic building, but work to achieve compatibility. Does that, and I can send something like that.
I'm in favor of, I like that a lot without the last sentence. I think,
Okay.
I think that says it. And that, to your point, and to Warren's point, I think this is a different issue, Warren, than the mere filters, because it's not a question, you know, if they pointed to somebody who slipped through, you know, somebody, you know, you can't use precedent, you know, if somebody slipped through and didn't follow the guidelines and now you want to rely on that, you know, that shouldn't happen. The flip side, though, is that definition of, you know, surrounding, in the district, adjacent, those kinds of, those are very, you know, those can be very important adjectives because it is eclectic. So I don't think that we should prescribe, no, you can't use something 2 blocks away. I mean, this is a pretty small area. So, you know, no, you can't use something that's a block over, you know, as precedent because it's too far away. That, I think that's problematic, because then if you're saying your scope has to be narrower, well, the house next door to you, you know, could be because of the various, you know, you don't necessarily, the house that's a block away may be more representative of what we all want it to look like than the house next door that happened to be the 60s ranch or, you know, post-war, whatever. So if we get too hung up on, you know, adjoining, adjacent, surrounding, which is why I personally favor other buildings in the district, but with the qualifier, with some of the language that was in the sentence that Jane read, be where I'd come out.
Jenny, do you want to jump in?
I do. I think this is a really good discussion, and something that ARB also struggled with. The surrounding word is really something that they guided us to use as part of this. And again, I think maybe that also gets to your point, Mr. Schneier, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's the one right next door, that you're sort of taking into context the larger scope, and that's ARB's purview, right, to understand that and weigh those various options and have that ultimate decision-making authority for that. So I'm wondering if there's some way to, I liked where Ms. Fox was going with her first statement. I think that was encapsulating, I think, where ARB was coming from, and because we did make changes specifically. I think it used to say adjacent, and we specifically chose surrounding at their direction. So maybe there's a way to clarify what surrounding means and how they would go about using that in their context. That would be my recommendation. And I guess also keep in mind, so this is our best effort at doing this
if ARB runs into problems, we can change this. So I think we want to get it to a point where everybody's feeling really comfortable with giving them good guidance to help applicants and staff moving forward. This isn't the last time we ever have to touch this. So if that helps, we don't have to have the 100% solution. If we can have the 90% solution, that's fine too. So.
Oh, Jenny, we're nailing it tonight.
I'm all for that. Let's do it. Let's do it.
We don't take these things lightly.
I want 110, actually, not 100.
There you go.
Don't you know that the sign "perfection is the enemy of good"?
That is true. Mm-hmm.
Maybe we'll shift gears a little bit. I forgot to ask, was there any public comment on this one, Nikki, that we should bring into the discussion?
I don't have any that has popped up at this time, and we didn't have any prior to this either.
Okay. It sounds like we're leaning, other interjections, comments, questions.
I like where the few sentences Jane prattled through, I think were effective. I like where Thad was going with a sort of catch-all comment about sort of use of precedent. These are all effective modifications in my book.
It seems like we're moving towards a space where we've made some recommendations on changes. Maybe we're moving towards not approving this tonight based on this feedback. Is that kind of the sense I'm getting from the commission? We want to request these additional change considerations.
I think it's important enough that we not attempt to wordsmith it tonight, would be my recommendation.
Yeah, and I agree with Mr. Snare. I think this is overarching enough relative to all the nuance that follows that it's worth getting right.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the spirit of it is that we want something that blends with the majority of the architecture in the historic district, which is not 1970s architecture, probably not 1950s architecture, so probably 1800 architecture, so 1800s architecture. So I think that's kind of how we have to, I think, fix it so that we don't get a 50s ranch built again, you know.
See, this is what's the interesting thing, and I think Leo, Mr. Grimes, I'm sorry, Mr. Grimes, I think there's a point here. It is a very eclectic historic district. And one of the things that came up, and I'm going to throw this out there, on South Riverview Street, along the river, there are 3 or 4 ranches, right? There's all kinds of stuff up and down Riverview Street. And some are contributing along the riverfront, and some are considered non-contributing. Probably 4 of them, and some are ranches and some aren't. So if you were allowed those to be demolished because they're non-contributing, you would change the entire character of the street, because part of the character of the street are these old 50s ranches. So I guess the question is very philosophical. Do you like an eclectic character in the historic district because that's what it's evolved to? And will you continue to allow it? Or do you want to go back to a certain period of time, like 1860 to 1910? Because that is the question we're having here. Warren, you bring it up, because I don't think the ARB necessarily wanted to keep it. Like Lance, if he had to design his building exactly like 2 doors down, it would be a brick. What is that, a Queen Anne or something? I mean, that Mr. Carr's house is a big 2-story Queen Anne with a slate roof. So it's hard, you know, I guess, I think the ARB is looking for leniency in their ability to design, to allow new construction to complement without being prohibitive, I guess.
I think that's, yeah. I think that's a point well taken. If there's 4 ranches in that area and they look good, yeah, I don't think you should tear down the 50s ranches because it is eclectic. But I think that if you had in the center of South High Street, you put a 50s ranch in between two of those cool looking houses, or even let's say next to Jane's house, okay, it might not look so good. So I think that's something that's really got to be, you know, wordsmithed or something to figure that out.
Miss Martin.
I think this is fantastic discussion, and you know, I really thank you all for, you know, thinking about these tough topics, because these are things that, you know, we've all struggled with all along. And I think having the opportunity to take another look at these, you know, is something that we can certainly do. Mr. Fishman, I would, you know, just make sure that we're all being cognizant that Franklin Street is part of historic Dublin, and it is very important to encourage preservation of that and not to encourage necessarily redevelopment, particularly with a particular, you know, mid-19th century aesthetic that's not indicative to that. So I think, you know, Mr. Grimes and Mr. Schneer talked about how eclectic the district is and how non-homogeneous it is. And I think that as part of the public engagement process, preserving that, particularly south of Bridge Street, was very, very important.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. I agree. And I'm not saying tear down all the 50s ranches. What I'm saying is that whatever we build new blends with whatever's around it and it's harmonious to the Bridge Street corridor, you know, the historical district.
Okay, so
Exactly why we picked the word surrounding. So I think maybe Jenny, myself, and Thad can take another look at making sure that the intent around the word surrounding is capturing the commission's discussion this evening.
So I have to ask Mr. Boggs, because we've given feedback on further consideration and changes for this guideline, I will no longer be looking for a motion to recommend approval to City Council, I'm guessing.
That's right. There would not be a motion to recommend approval. It would be a motion just to take further discussion.
Okay, so Jane Fox.
Oh, yeah, if you don't mind, Ms. Kennedy, there was another particular topic I wanted to bring up that I had talked to staff about a little bit earlier, but I think it's important that I bring it up to planning and zoning because it's one subtopic that I don't think has been addressed really very extensively at all in the guidelines. And it would be under, Nikki might have to point me to the space, site design. Is that where we're going here? Okay, under site design on page 52. I have a concern about protecting our cultural landscape. Landscaping is mentioned here, but I think there has to be some consideration for the protection of what is called historic cultural landscape. And let me just kind of give you an understanding of what that is. In the historic district and under the National Park Service, they describe the historic cultural landscape as in 4 different ways. And I don't even know if, I wish I could put this slide up, but topography is considered a protected landscaped asset. And in the historic district, because we're on the riverfront, we have a fall from about, I would say almost 100 feet from High Street down to the riverfront. And that landscape along the riverfront is considered a historic asset because it held 2 old stone quarries. It has old stone wall construction all along the edges of it where there was previous historical buildings. We have the Indian Run Ravine, which is a historic Indian landscape with, you know, all of the beautiful waterfalls and all of that. But nowhere in the guidelines do we have any kind of application on how to protect it. And the National Park Service even considers old cemeteries, ponds and lakes, rivers, waterways, particular contours, archaeological land masses that might, like the Indian mounds. If we had Indian mounds within the historic district, that would be a cultural landscape asset. We don't talk about them at all in these guidelines. And if you think about it, we have very little buildings left, but we have a lot of land mass within the historic district that falls under this category. So my suggestion to staff was, there is quite a bit of information about how to create some guidelines around that, how to protect it. And I would like to see it added in the guidelines. And I'd like to hear what you have to say. We couldn't certainly wordsmith it tonight, but there's plenty of wordsmithing out there that's existing. And in order to go forward with that, we would need to have direction from planning and zoning to be able to do that work. So any thoughts?
Ms. Martin, was that part of the discussion ever through this process? Do you have any background or public information you can share on that topic from Jane?
Regarding cultural landscapes and cultural resources, this was an item that was previously raised, and staff did attempt to incorporate it in a more limited fashion, perhaps. That is incorporated right in the overview sections. So let me get you the page. It looks like page 16. We talk about cultural landscapes and resources. Based on the input that Ms. Fox has provided, I do think there is an opportunity to make that section more robust and to provide an overview of what that means, but then also to provide specific recommendations regarding the resources that we have here in Dublin, just to ensure that the expectation is clear regarding how those should be treated in a sensitive manner.
One of the things too, and I'll just mention this, one of the things too that Architecture Review Board struggles with at times is that when new construction comes into the historic district, oftentimes site design puts a short one-story level at the street, but on the back, because the topography falls so deeply, they argue for 4 or 5 stories instead of respecting the topography of the landscaping and say terracing a building down the side of the hill, which would make for an attractive view across the riverfront. They don't have any teeth in this guideline to help them guide that site design with respect to topography, or some of the and we've seen it as new buildings have come in the historic district. Stone walls have been knocked down, riverfronts have been cleared of old historic landscape features. And as if this school should ever leave and the Greenway or in the Indian Run Ravine isn't protected by something like this, it is protected, but there's no applicability protection. There are no rules or regulations for the ARB to say, well, you can't build a condominium up against the Indian Run Ravine because we don't have anything here that says that you can do that. So I guess what I'm saying is I see this as a void because there is so much in the way of beautiful land within the historic district that has great historic character. I just would like staff to have the opportunity to play around with if there's a way to give them some teeth to protect it.
Is the rest of the commission in favor of this proposal from Ms. Fox? Maybe thumbs up just to show support. Okay. That was a good call out. Anything else?
One small little request, and it's not a change, and it will be very easy. On the Appendix G of all the historic buildings outside of the district, do you think that you can bold the ones that are city-owned? I think it would be nice for people to know what the city owns in the way of historic. And then,
Yeah, certainly.
yeah. And then, oh, and this in the storefront, were those changes, Nikki, that we talked about, wanting to suggest? Did they haven't shown up in this. Can we talk about that just a little bit? The historic storefront rehabilitation, I had mentioned that I thought that we use the word avoid in all four bullet points on there, and I would have liked to have seen what we expect instead of what we want to avoid. And Nikki made some suggested changes that maybe we could run past really quickly to see if you feel okay about that. It's let me see what page it is. It's on page looks like 43. A, B, C, and D, each one starts with a void, and I thought there might be a better way to give some direction instead of just an avoidance. Nikki was kind enough to make some suggestions, if you'd like to share those.
Yes, just give me one moment, please. Okay.
And I don't mind if we use avoid. I just wanted to add some sort of directional language as well.
Okay. So there were two sections that Ms. Fox had asked me to take a look at, particularly the commercial storefront design. And after that was brought to our attention, I do think there are opportunities to phrase those items in the positive versus the negative, or just simply what we are looking for versus what we are not looking for. So the proposal is as follows. Would you like me to read through that, or are you able to read that legibly?
Do my fellow commissioners agree? Okay. Yeah, Mr. Schneer.
Am I muted? No. Two things. Just stylistic, but a comma after character in A. And then I think there's a typo in D and inappropriate.
And could I ask you, Nikki, if on A, do you think it would be, I hate to change ARB's work. Do you think that adding, avoid, removing, downsizing, or expanding storefront windows and features could be added to the sentence in A, so that we don't remove something that maybe they believed was an important point? We don't have to remove it, but I like what you put in the first sentence.
Yeah, we can absolutely add that companion piece back in.
Okay.
And then the next set of changes that were proposed, this is in the new construction section, but it was intended to begin to address some of the items that Ms. Fox had mentioned, including as well in the building site design section. And this is related to the topography, specifically how new development would be sited on the topography.
I'm not sure in 5.3D whether or not adding and similar in overall heights to surrounding buildings, because some of the infill that's going to be happening on North High Street might not be what they want in similar heights to surrounding buildings. And I think I'd be afraid to put that in unless I knew that ARB was feeling really good about that. I do think that form and mass of the building should be responsible to the surrounding topography. I like that, but I think I'd leave out the overall height piece from my opinion, but I'd like to hear what others say.
Ms. Fox, maybe another opportunity for clarification, and perhaps Thad, myself, and Jenny can work on this, but I think at least from a staff perspective, I believe the intent was that it be surrounding buildings within the architectural review district. It's important to keep in mind that many of these buildings that are larger in height, scale, and mass are now outside of the boundary of the architectural review district. While I know that to be the intent, I do not believe it's explicitly stated.
Right,
So
you're right. That's a good
I think
call.
we should revisit it.
Yeah, that's a great call, Nikki. Thank you.
Any other call outs, Ms. Fox?
Nope, that's all I had.
Anyone else from the commission have anything else to bring up with regard to this guideline? Okay, well, it sounds like we will be looking for a motion for further consideration of this guideline by staff, thus not approving it moving on to City Council as the next step. Is that how do I want to phrase this motion? Ms. Martin.
Before we make the motion, I would make a request for the commission to consider, and this would not certainly be a requirement, but whether or not there would be 2 members of the commission that would like to collaborate directly with staff on review of the proposed revisions prior to it coming back to the commission. This is an approach that we had taken with 2 members of the Architectural Review Board to ensure that we were hitting the mark. Certainly, you know, we would only be making modifications in response to your discussion this evening, but want to ensure some consistency. So, you know, I won't, you know, ask anyone to volunteer this evening, but I did want to raise that for your consideration.
I'll volunteer. I will volunteer. What does it
Oh,
take?
great.
2 steps back?
Mr. Schneier.
Yeah.
Mr.
Put
Fishman,
your
you're
money where your mouth is.
to chime in.
I'd like to nominate Jane and Lance. They have they have a stake in the historical district, and they made great comments tonight, so I think they should be the 2 people.
I'm happy to do it, but I wasn't going to put my hand out in case anybody else wanted to. So if anybody else wants to, I will get eyes on it again, but I'm happy to if no one else wants.
Great.
And Mr. Schneier, are you in agreement as well?
Yes, I'm fine.
Thank you.
I really appreciate that.
I think Nikki should get a veto about who joins this effort, though.
Okay.
Mark?
What was that, Mr. Fishman?
Mark could be a 3rd one. He made great comments tonight.
Yeah, well done.
We did keep the group small.
Okay.
Kennedy, to answer your question, you would be asking the commission to make a motion to table this request.
Thank you, Ms. Martin. I'd like to request the commission for a motion to table
So
this
moved.
case. Thank you, Mr. Grimes. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Fishman.
Mr. Mr. Schneider,
Yes.
Ms. Fox,
Yes.
Mr. Supalack,
Yes.
Mr. Grimes,
Yes.
Mr. Fishman,
Yes.
Ms. Kennedy.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Beal. Thank you, Ms. Martin, for your time there. We'll move on to our last case of the evening. This is case number 3, the Dublin City Hall at 5555 Perimeter Drive. This application is for a review and recommendation to City Council to rezone 5.03 acres from suburban office and institutional district to a planned unit development district, Kaufman Park. The site is west of the intersection of Perimeter Drive with Emerald Parkway. And Ms. Martin, you have our case tonight.
Great. Give me just 1 second. I will pull up my presentation. Okay, good evening. So as mentioned, this is a request for a rezoning and preliminary development plan for the new City Hall located at 555 Perimeter Drive. The site is located west of Emerald Parkway and south of the intersection with Perimeter Drive. The site is surrounded by other municipal buildings, including the Dublin Justice Center immediately to the west, Kaufman Park to the north, as well as the City of Dublin Development Building, the Kaufman Homestead, and the Dublin Recreation Center. So a bit of history regarding the Kaufman Park Planned Unit Development District. This Planned Unit Development District was originally conceived in 1994. At that time, it incorporated 2 land areas together, 28 acres, as well as an additional 18. The intent at that time was to facilitate the construction of the Dublin Rec Center. And then also to establish an area for both passive and active park uses at a kind of pivotal crossroads within the city of Dublin. Subsequently, in 2007, the Planned Unit Development District was rezoned. And at that time, the rezoning incorporated 4 additional parcels on the north side of Post Road. At the time in 2007, these parcels contained a single family home, as well as several agricultural structures. The single family home has since been demolished. In 2011, an additional 42 acres were added to the Kaufman Park PUD. This addition was of land that was south of Post Road. Those of you that have lived in the city of Dublin for any length of time may recall Post Road bisecting Kaufman Park. And with the rezoning in 2011, Post Road was subsequently disconnected and realigned to create a larger consolidated land area for parks and recreation, as well as surrounding municipal facilities. This rezoning was in accordance with the 2007 community plan, which really did call for a municipal complex. So now today, the city of Dublin had the opportunity to purchase the existing building at the intersection of Emerald Parkway and Perimeter Drive. The building is presently on a single parcel with an additional parcel to the southwest. The second parcel, not shown here on the aerial, presently contains the City Hall addition for council chambers. The site today is zoned suburban office and institutional, and with this rezoning would be incorporated into the Kaufman Park Planned Unit Development. So with every planned unit development, there is a development text. The development text is basically an outline of zoning standards that need to be followed. Given the iterative nature of the Kaufman Park PUD over time. At this time, it seemed prudent to establish a sub-area map. Sub-areas allow certain standards to apply to certain geographies, while the larger area maintains a cohesive zoning district. So sub-area A represents the 1994 and 2007 rezoning. Sub-area B represents the 2011 rezoning. And sub-area C, which is the Dublin City Hall site, represents the proposed 2021 rezoning. So with the establishment of sub-area C, those development standards include permitted uses, which are municipal and administrative functions, civic uses, parks and open spaces, as well as those uses that are permitted today under the suburban office and institutional district. The site development standards, including setbacks, lot coverage, parking, and landscaping, are proposed to be unchanged as the site currently complies with the suburban office and institutional site development standards. This rezoning also adds sign provisions for this key municipal building. So with this, 2 wall signs are proposed to be allowed. One wall sign is intended to facilitate identification of the main City Hall administrative office building, as well as the council chambers. Additionally, there would be an allowance for a placemaking art sign or some type of public art activation in the future that may or may not be affixed to the building, but should it be, it would be limited to 65 square feet and no greater than 20 feet in height. And then, as you may know, if you drive past the site, there are 2 existing ground signs today, and those are proposed to be retained. So with that, staff is recommending a recommendation of approval to the Planning and Zoning Commission. I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Martin. Questions? Questions for Nikki to start us off? Yeah, Mr. Supalak.
Nikki, who owns the crop field that is between Perimeter, is it Emerald or Perimeter and the highway?
A private property owner.
Got it. Okay.
Other questions? Oh, Mr. Schneier.
Oh, now I'm not muted. The artwork sign, who determined the size of that, the maximum size of that?
Yeah, so the proposed areas are based on design concepts. That design concept was included in your packet, although it is not intended to be identical to what is shown. The discretion provided in the development text says as approved by the city manager. So city council, basically in collaboration with the office of the city manager, would be able to choose what that imagery is. And that 65 square feet is based on a roughly 8 by 8 area.
Thank you.
Ms. Martin, have we received any public comment on this?
We have not received any public comment.
Thank you. Maybe we'll open it up for discussion then. Anyone want to provide comments or insights on the proposal? Or no concerns?
No concerns.
Thank you, Mr.
No
Supel.
concerns.
Okay, Mr. Grimes?
I think it probably is about time it came together like this so that you can look at the whole complex in a unique and comprehensive way. So I no problems.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add comments or conclusionary statements? Okay, well, it sounds like we are in support of this proposal. So Thank you, everyone. I would be looking for a motion to recommend approval to City Council to rezone the 5.03 acres from suburban office and institutional district to a planned unit development district, Kaufman Park. Looking for a motion.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Fishman. Thank you, Mr. Grimes.
Mr. Supalack,
Yes.
Ms. Fox,
Yes,
Mr. Schneier,
Yes.
Ms. Kennedy,
Yes.
Mr. Fishman.
Yes.
Did I call your name, Mark? Mr. Supalack, okay.
Thank you, Ms. Beal. That will be the end of our case section for tonight's meeting. We're next going to move into goal setting. And I believe Ms. Roush will be walking us through this next segment. Is that correct?
That's correct. And Tammy's here to assist as well. And again, really just want to keep this really open-ended. I think Nikki provided you the potential discussion questions ahead of time, just so you maybe had a chance to think about it. And I will share those each as we go along, just so you can provide us some comments. And I appreciate your time for this, because our goal with this is to begin this discussion about a year ago, actually, right before everything came to a screeching halt. So we wanted the opportunity to come before you tonight and talk through and further this discussion about training, expectations, onboarding, all those really important things to help staff support you in your decision making as you move through this next year. So we really want to take the opportunity to walk through and understand how we can best do that. I know that you each had the opportunity recently to meet with the mayor and the vice mayor to provide some specific comments, and I know there's some action items coming out of that as well, based on everyone's input and comments, which we will take into account before we come back with a true sort of plan for how we're going to tackle this year. But I know that's definitely on our radar as well. And just for your awareness, we're going to do this with ARB and BZA as well, just to understand if there's some overlapping pieces as we've done in the past, with ethics training, conflict of interest, sort of those standard items that need to be reviewed. But we want to make sure that if there's something specific that the commission wants us to cover, or make sure you get some education or training on this year, that we have the opportunity to provide that for you. So I guess with that, unless anybody has any initial questions, I was just going to sort of open it up and ask the questions and get some feedback. Our goal tonight would be to get some initial feedback, and then we will take that away, synthesize that, and then provide some opportunity. I think we put it back on your next agenda. That way we sort of keep this moving and outline if there's some priorities of information, the things you'd rather do sooner than later, and things we can implement along the way. Because again, given our workload, we can't do everything all at one time, but just to provide some guardrails around what you're. So, any initial questions or thoughts on this? Okay. So the first question that we had for you all to consider, and I can share my screen just to keep us focused here. Everybody see that? Yes, my presentation slide, everybody can see that? Sorry, I can't see you all. Okay. So what training and educational topics would the commission like to participate or learn more about in 2021? So if anybody has some thoughts or comments related to that. And again, it can be our typical sort of legal training, review of criteria, things like that. But if there's other bigger picture things as well, happy to support you and provide that.
Hey, Jenny, I'll chime in here. I'm thinking back to the presentation that we had about the sustainability initiatives in the community. I thought that was a really great micro training session, so that I could kind of open our eyes as a commission to the other initiatives happening in the city, and kind of help us understand what other priorities are out there as we approach our planning and zoning. So I don't know if there are other things like that that should be considered, but I thought that was a great step in the, you know, in a good direction.
Great. Okay, that's very helpful.
But I appreciated bringing the content to the meeting itself. You know, we've already blocked these days for this purpose. So if we're all together and we can tag on some kind of topic or training, that seems like a good method.
Okay.
Jenny, do you mind if I ask a follow-up question?
Please.
Ms. Kennedy, do you have a preference in how that type of training is conducted? Is it someone coming and speaking? Is it YouTube? Is there any type of preference?
I mean, just from my own personal opinion, I like the in-person because if we wanted to have some Q&A, I think that's a great opportunity to have a discussion. I always like hearing what my fellow commissioners say also. So I think having us as a group together for that would be my only preference, but I defer to my commissioners, of course, too. Please chime in.
I second hearing it in person. It's invaluable, one, to hear you guys know how it is. The videos and the presentations can only tell so much. You got a wealth of the color commentary, not just from the person presenting it, but then from the ancillary sort of staff members, and yes, then reaction from the group. I second the entire thing. That context and understanding, right? It's sort of along the lines of what's the vision for the city. It's just that that transportation thing had a whole, like, we didn't even know any of that was going on in those considerations. So that gives a wealth of context relative to the projects we look at.
Thank you.
Jane, do you have some comments?
I do, and I know that the group knows that I would probably bring this up, but I would love to hear a professor of architecture come and give us a little guidance on how to evaluate good architecture. How, you know, the architects speak that that we're using, or that Mr. Schneier sent forward is invaluable, but I don't know if we can use it. But I would love to learn a little bit more about a checklist of ways for an ordinary commission can really do a good job of evaluating architecture when you're not an architect.
I agree. I think maybe Mark could give some of that talk on materials. I think materials make a lot of difference, and I think that I would love to have an architect talk to us about quality and what kind of end product we get with what, and I think that's really important.
I'm taking notes while you're talking here. Sorry. No, I think that's great, and we can look at all those things. Tammy, did you have a follow-up question for that?
No, I was just going to let you know, I'll take notes and
Okay.
you go forth.
Okay. I mean, other items maybe for some feedback on community plan training, how this should be used. Would that be beneficial to you all for us to dive into how to incorporate that, how we incorporate that in our reviews? Would that be helpful to you? Thumbs up. I'm seeing some thumbs up.
That's
okay.
a yes for me.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, good. I know we try to incorporate that in our reports, but without some further discussion about what all the pieces and parts mean. And we will also do a training here shortly, or not training, but update on the 2035 framework plan that's being developed, and then the subsequent update of the community plan, just so you all know what that is, where that is as well. Okay, what else? I'm trying to think. Nikki, what else, or Tammy, did we talk about any other items? And we probably will do a refresher of our legal conflict of interest, sunshine laws, those types of things, just so that's always how to run an effective meeting. Those things I think are helpful to refresh everybody. If everybody's okay with that, we would incorporate that again.
Jenny, one of the things that we talked about that I know council was told that planning and zoning would look at is this question of density
Oh,
and housing needs within the city based on demographics and that sort of thing. So I think that's really important. We did talk about having, especially when it came to these senior housing, maybe even having community conversation with people to see what it is they're actually looking for versus what the developers say they're looking for, so that we can make sure that we integrate the wishes of the citizens instead of, maybe just hearing one perspective on what's needed. So I think this housing and density issue, types of housing, need for housing, demographic of the housing, relationship, sort of ratio of housing to commercial, that is a big question for council. And I know that they were hoping planning and zoning would talk about that.
Yeah, that's great. And Tammy is sort of heading up our housing study 2.0. So MORPC did a study related to housing, and there were some outcomes of that. And then I know that we are looking at sort of drilling down further on that. So I think that will help inform that conversation, Jane, and we can look at how to do that. And we do owe you some feedback, and I think that ties in nicely with this for that residential design standards or policy. So we've had some opportunity to look into that as well. So we'll be bringing that forward here for your consideration. And again, I think part of that, your previous direction was to do some outreach and get some input for that. So we'll include that as well. Mr. Schneier, I saw your hand go up. You're muted, sorry.
Just to add on to Jay's comment, maybe even a more macro view of just trends that might affect the work we do, and housing, and the demographics would be one of them. There's a community part of this, but there's also, just hearing from a developer who does not have, a pending application. What are they seeing? Because we're being asked, this is what people want. Well, I give that some credence because they have to sell the stuff, so presumably that is what people want. But in a more generic thing, we've talked about, we've touched on things like mobility issues, so density, just where are things going? Because we get it anecdotally, one application at a time. But what are the overall industry trends that affect the work that we do?
Leo, sorry, Christine, I feel like I'm stealing your job. I'm sorry.
No, I can't see everyone's faces, Jenny. So
okay.
please do.
I can stop sharing my screen here. Maybe
it's your discussion.
Yeah.
Jenny, the 2035 plan might have some of the answers for some of the development in the outer areas, University Boulevard, that area. But it would also be helpful to know a little bit about our quote unquote regional partners in some of this, and what their positions are. What are some of the different kinds of hoops some of them may go through in Union County and the townships outside, so that we could kind of get a flavor of where we are in this mix and how to properly reflect those that we're serving or serve with. But also to be open to the ideas of others from outside, so that there's somewhat of a seamless transition between Dublin and the areas around it. I think those kind of overviews would be helpful.
Great. That's a great suggestion. And I know Tammy sits on a number of those boards as our sort of regional partner and keeping that, and Jane actually as well. So I think that would be a really good opportunity for us to provide you that background. Warren, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, my colleagues said a lot of what I was going to say, but I think we brought up density. I think if you bring a developer in, there's not a developer that I know of in Central Ohio that isn't going to talk about being denser for obvious reasons. About 20 years ago, a consultant brought to council a program to have dense housing, but surrounded by green space. In other words, if the land was zoned 2 units per acre, you still got 2 units per acre, but you had the housing dense, and surrounded by it was a green space. Okay, so you have the same amount of green space, and I think that's something. It's in on one of your dusty shelves somewhere, because it was a big deal for several months. That was one, and then another program was what they call WOW, which is used on Brand Road. One of your planners came up with the expression WOW, and it was huge setbacks from the road. On Brand, you see there's 200-foot setbacks with ponds and so on. And so I think that I'd like to see some ideas, and those seem to have died. You know, the recession came and things happened, and they died, but they were national ideas. Consultants brought these ideas from other places, and they worked in other places, especially on the East Coast. And so I'd like to see somebody talking about some of those things again, because we can talk about density till we're blue in the face. I don't know, as I said, I don't know a developer who would say, "Oh, yeah, let's make them less dense." Okay, but I think we can do density and accomplish senior housing and all those kind of things, but still have the green space and still have the feeling that most people want in Dublin, and so on. And there were two ideas, and it said they died, and so maybe I'd like to hear some more about that.
Okay, yeah, a number of those things are actually incorporated in the community plan. So those scenic road setbacks, those are recommendations as part of area plan. So a lot of those just were incorporated in the community plan. But again, I think that all ties together as part of the same discussion about what the community is looking for, the character, quality, and all of those pieces. How do they fit together?
You can get density and still have green space. You know, that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yep.
Jenny, do you think there's any chance that we could get a speaker on the pocket neighborhoods piece? I don't know if the pocket neighborhoods, I mean, I think it'd be interesting for planning and zoning to hear it. I think it'd be interesting for anybody to come and hear it. Pocket neighborhoods are a lot like what you're talking about, Warren. It's a new thing that's kind of trendy out in the West. It's very dense, smaller units, very, they incorporate all of the landscape features. You feel as if you're in a little enclave of small homes surrounded by great landscape, but it's dense. I think Seattle is where it started, but I'd love to hear a speaker on something like that, or even maybe some of the major architecture firms who are doing work all over the country could come and speak about what the trends of housing are. Maybe we could be broader than just that. I'd love to hear about that.
Right, I would too.
Yeah,
And
those
Jane,
are really
just
good
a-
suggestions.
Oh, sorry, Jen. So one of the cities that I really love, if you've been to Savannah, they have great small park areas everywhere, and they can be blocks away from one another, and they're all usable. So I think one of those key components is what makes people gather there. You know, if you have too much, you're not going to get the concentration of people. If you have too little, you're going to get too much. So I think that's something we can really explore, because they've just done a great job, and it's beautiful and active and fun. So
Is there, relative to this, so Savannah is obviously not a new, hip, trendy kind of development, right? Nor is what is it? I'm going to the one in Florida, not Rosemary Beach, but near Rosemary Beach. Seaside, right? So to the point of, I wonder if there's just merit to slowly but surely, and then this doesn't have to be someone else coming in as much as perhaps it's one of you presenting these compelling neighborhoods, these compelling things with a little bit of, I'm going back to now it's school, and right, like before you design anything, you start with, I'm going to look at Savannah as a precedent, right? Different than the precedent we usually use. And you unpack it, and we study it, and we digest it, and go, aha. And at some point, that cultivates into a language, a shared language that we can look at each other and be like, you know, it's like Savannah, or you're right, Rosemary Beach, or, you know, Pocket Park type of stuff becomes a fruitful shared tribal language. And we don't have to fly anybody in to make the speech.
Right.
Good. No, that's great. Those are great suggestions. And also as part of this 2035 framework, there is discussion about having experts come in depending on the various committees and what their desire is to learn about that. So I think that maybe helps tie into some of these ideas as well, the trends and things that, you know, we should be thinking big, we should be thinking what's going to happen in the next 15 years and how do we accommodate that and think about that. So this all fits together, but I like your suggestion, Mark, so it becomes a common language, right? To us, it's potentially foreign at the moment, but if we really are, you know, in agreement on how this works, then and what the words are and what our desires are, then that everybody's speaking the same.
Yeah, and we'll get efficient about it because it'll become a shorthand.
Yeah.
Right. We used to talk about Hilton Head a lot when it came to
Yeah,
commercial.
sure, Hilton Head.
Yeah, yeah,
Add that to the list. It's interesting.
yeah, yeah. So
Okay, well, we can always come back to this if there's other thing. Jane, did you have something else?
Just one more that we talk about all the time and I think would be worth visiting, and it could just be at staff level or we could just talk about it as a group, is placemaking. We use the word all the time. And I know as West Innovation District and the Metro Blazer area starts to grow and develop, placemaking is going to be an essential component to make that integrated area work. And if we don't understand truly how to implement placemaking in there, and I put myself in that category, I think we need a deeper understanding of how to incorporate placemaking into these development plans. And I would love a little understanding of that.
Is that, how about this, relative to this, you know, there's a certain amount of study good precedents and start to accumulate a language and an awareness of that. Is it just kind of the same thing? Let's periodically look at and study a good place and a series of good places.
Yeah, and then maybe there's some handbook policy, some things, right, that we can reference, you know, as you're preparing for your meetings as well. So that's a great suggestion.
I think to piggyback off of Mark's comment, that was kind of the intent of the National Planners meeting that sometimes Planning and Zoning Commission members would take advantage of. And we go to, I know Warren has been on a number of them, we would go to a city for the convention and then we'd get a walking tour of a specific neighborhood. I have not been, I did not take part in it. I wish I had, but I think that would be, you know, once things get back and travel is available, that could be a good opportunity as well.
And this year it's a virtual conference, so that's a good segue of if you're interested, we can provide some information to you on how to register for that, because then you can access it at the beginning of May. So that is an opportunity for commission members, and it's much, has, you know, lots of great sessions, to your point, Christina, that you wouldn't necessarily have access to. And council did in November virtually attend the World Cities conference. And we can see if some of those are still available, some topics or things that might be of interest to this group as well. That was helping council and staff inform this 2035 vision. But a great, same idea, where you're being exposed to new things, new ideas. So. Okay, well, I'll go on to the next one and then we can always come back if things pop up as this goes on. So I won't put the slide up there because I think that's hard to see everybody. You talked about it a little bit with Tammy's initial question about what's the format of these, and I think we've definitely kind of covered that. So I'm hearing preferences in person so we can have some dialogue, but you know, if there is some training that you can either conference level where you can watch that, that would be something that you all would be amenable to or interested in potentially, and that we can provide, like I said, we can provide that information. Do you like the opportunity of some self-paced things where we could provide you with some content, you all look at that, and then we discuss it as a group? Or what's your feeling on that? Or you really like having it as a group ahead of time?
I think the combination is going to have to rule depending on the subject or the professional that's available or whatever. So, you know, it all depends on what it is. I don't know that we could decide that right now.
Okay, but you're not opposed to that, I guess, is what
No.
Okay.
Jenny, I was even thinking like a panel discussion with other like community leaders that we may want to hear from their challenges. We kind of talked about that today in our 2035 meeting, but you know, what other commissions, or what are they dealing with? What are they, you know, what are they tackling? How are they tackling it? I don't know how you feel about that as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. How do you all like the potential idea for that for other communities coming in and providing some dialogue? Okay. And some of that might be better later in the year if we ever get to a point where we're all back together. That might be a good spot to be in the same room with people to talk that through. Okay. The next thing is then planning projects, which again, you sort of touched on that, but are there other planning projects that we're working on and maybe you're not even aware enough to know? So that's a good reference point for us to start with, is how to provide you and your interest in being provided on what long range projects we're working on, things that are sort of in the pipeline that we're working on. Is that of interest to everybody?
I would say, is it possible maybe with the chair's agenda that there might be a staff note at the end for what the next 3 months looks like? Not that you're committing to the agenda. It's just that these are projects that are floating to the top of the staff. So that way the commission could be let known. If there's questions, they could call or contact someone or something along those lines. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. I actually do a monthly report to council of the actions that you've taken. And then there's also a section of that just lists pending cases that are coming before each board. So I could provide you that memo so that you could see what's been submitted, and some of them don't have target dates, but we do provide that ahead of time for council just for their awareness. We could definitely include that as well. We are also working on a database of information that look at our long range projects and where those are in the pipeline. So we're working on that here this first quarter of the year. So that's definitely something we could keep you in the loop on for that too, because I think some of those things end up coming before you, and that would be nice for you to have some awareness of that as they move forward.
Jenny, what's the chance? We get some great memos about what the upcoming projects are, or whether a roundabout's being done, or if there's traffic. I think for the Planning and Zoning Commission to really understand overall what's happening in the city, because we talk about connectivity, we talk about building style, we talk about all sorts of things that then impact neighborhoods. Is there any way that when you send these out, I'm sure it has to run by Dana, but we certainly could just send it out to the email as well for, to have their own references as to what's happening in the city so that they're up to date on what new developments are going on and construction. When we were talking about fiber, there's all kinds of things here that I think are really important for them to be aware of. And it's the only way to do it is regular updates.
And yeah, and I know engineering provides CIP project updates and engineering updates similar to planning's updates. So I don't see why, that's public record. So I don't see why we couldn't just incorporate that. And maybe it's a folder within your OneDrive folder that has, reference material, and it could be, engineering reports, CIP projects, things like that. We could just add those to it. So for your reference, that's definitely something that's already out there that would be beneficial for y'all to understand what's happening. Is that what you're referring to, Jane? What you get through council?
Yeah, I was. I always like to see, if it comes if it comes monthly and it comes printed in a material, 4 or 5 pages, it's just nice to brief through it. It's so hard sometimes to go back to OneDrive to dig all the way down and then read it that way. It's kind of nice to throw it into a file and know that you've glanced through it, highlighted a few things, and it's in your memory. It gets read that way.
Okay. Yeah, we can look at and trying to incorporate that on a regular basis too. Okay, then the next item was, what can staff do to help assist you? So in preparing for your meeting. So I think at this, we're really looking at, and maybe that goes with the next question too, is, as we provide information, staff reports, materials, presentations, is there additional, how are our staff reports? Is the information in there in a way that's helpful to you? Would you like more of something, less of something? Same with presentations. We just want to make sure that we're giving you the information that you need to make good decisions, and want to make sure that the time we're spending is beneficial to you as well. So if you have some feedback for us about there's changes or things you would like to see done differently or organized differently, we could definitely look at how to accommodate that.
Jenny, I think you and the staff do a great job with those reports. And I think you've made some modifications over the last several years with, you know, zooming out, zooming in, giving us some contextual references of what, you know, surrounding buildings are and things like that, which I think have been a great addition. And also when I know when you kick off some of the presentations, you show us, you know, where we are in the phase of approval. So I think that's been a great addition as well, at least when I was a new commissioner, helping me in the learning process. So you've made some great changes that I've seen and have been useful over the past several years. So I appreciate that, but no new suggestions from me.
Okay, okay. Okay, well, I'm going to take your, I mean, again, and if you think of something afterwards, you can always email us. This won't be the last time we talk about this. But yeah, and that's a great perspective as a new commission person coming into this. It is really challenging to get the group dynamic, know what you're supposed to be looking at. There's review criteria. What am I looking at? What am I saying? We just want to make sure that everybody's equipped with all that information. Okay, well, that's all the questions that I had for you all, at least to consider. Are there other things that you can think of this year that you would like to talk about now, or things you want to raise for our awareness? Mark.
So I guess I don't know how to solve this one. This actually might be a sort of question for Thad, or a sort of comment for Thad if he's still listening, although his kids might be done with their dessert by this point. So in my one-on-one with Chris and Kathy, I started to talk about, right, architecture is it's a visual language. So there's, even from my vantage point, it's hard when you're sitting on the dais and articulating something, right? And anytime we're articulating a modification to a change, and I feel like even there's a recent case, it might be a still ongoing case, I guess I shouldn't actually mention it, but I've talked about massing, a massing adjustment. The massing on the end of the buildings has to be different, and right, mentally that can be interpreted as, oh, I'm just going to bump it out a foot. Yay, more massing, right? And that's not, of course, the interpretation. So a lot of times in architecture and discussing architecture, and when people are sitting next to each other discussing a project, there's pencils involved, there's drawing involved. So that massing commentary comes with, you know, something like this. Right, so it becomes a very kind of back and forth and iterative thing. And I know staff, you guys have that opportunity while you're sitting with, right, where there's plenty of people come inside, they develop rapport back and forth, they want to do it right, and so you guys have opportunity, but we don't necessarily, and so we're sort of stuck making comments from the dais, and as short of getting really specific about it, right? Getting really specific has its merits. At the same time, it also, right, I'm going to say this, most of us are really not designers, so we shouldn't actually get that specific as much as generally challenge the massing needs to get better and let them run away and do it. And so I'm just articulating this. I don't know what the solve is as much as I recognize that gap and that shortcoming. A lot of times, right, any of these projects, I'd love to have a conversation with somebody and be scribble scratching and pulling out pictures a lot more than we actually do, right? Jane on occasion has pulled up alternate pictures out of the coffers and impacted the conversation, but we don't do that a lot. And I think there's an opportunity there to just, you know what I mean, how do we develop a better visual language that helps to augment our verbal language with some of these reviews, specifically the informal side. And I'm just saying it, I don't know it, you know what I mean, I think there's a lot of rules around how we do or don't sort of have to interact with a project. I don't know if there's other commissions out there doing kind of a little bit of a different dance with them or not, but might be opportunity there.
Yeah, that's a great point, and maybe that wants to chime in too. We have definitely tried that before, where we did sort of a work session style, where we did a little more design collaboration. That it was challenging to try to do that, but I think also part of it, and we've had this discussion at ARB recently, is people coming before ARB, and honestly, in terms of also coming from a planning commission with an idea that looks fully baked, and there's not a lot of opportunity for that initial feedback and discussion. And we have discussed amongst ourselves, sort of setting some parameters of, you can bring, I'm going to make up a number, 5 sheets with you. One is a site plan, one is some massing, one is something about materials. You know, they pick what that is, but it's not bringing full-blown design development level drawings to you and then asking for your feedback. So that there's a little more opportunity up front to talk about that and collaborate.
And less sunk cost on their side, yeah.
Right. So really trying to formalize what that is and give them that guidance up front, because a lot of them have put a ton of time and effort into that, and that really makes it hard for us to, and for the boards and commissions to make real changes that they, aren't fully committed to what that's going to look like. So that's a really great point. And I have personally been tasked with how to help solve the architecture dilemma, and whether it's a consultant or a staff person or something, to make sure that staff is more prepared and robust in our language about architecture, and guiding you all and providing some additional background. That way you all feel equipped. So that message has definitely trickled down to planning directly and how we solve that. We're not quite there yet, but that is on my to do. I've been tasked with that this year to help solve that for all of our things. So that's a great call out, Mark.
I'd love to. I really like what Mark had to say. There is this angst, I think, that is felt, and I've heard it, and all of us have heard it, where developers or people come and say, we're just too hard to get anything through. And on the other hand, we've heard from many council members who say it has to be quality. Well, these are all very vague words. What is hard about it? That's what I'd like to know. Secondly, what does quality look like? And 3, how do you want us to apply it? I mean, the criteria are there, that's true, but they can be very vague. How far do we go? Do we say exactly what that window looks like, or do we say we're not happy with the facade? I'm not sure where the boundaries are sometimes. I think that's a conversation that I'd love to have, to understand, where those tight points are, and to be a little bit more cohesive in having the conversation among us, and then summarizing it in a way that is applicable for someone to walk away and know what we're actually talking about. I hope we do that, but I also know it's difficult.
Yeah, I think to those points, I think that ultimately, at least when we're reviewing, a lot of the plans that come through this commission, if push came to shove, we want to have a record that can be taken, to court and used to defend the decision of the Planning and Zoning Commission. But that happens obviously very rarely. But we do need to make sure that we always have that private property owner's ability to be heard, that private property owner is kind of ultimately they're driving the bus on the application, right? But I think that the idea of having maybe some kind of a work session concept that can be more free flowing, but perhaps a pre-application sort of thing that wouldn't go into that appellate process as part of the record. Having a more precise way of speaking about these things, because I surmise that you don't want to actually be designing windows or plans, but you want to be able to communicate what your expectation is. So I think that that's something we can work with, and maybe, by the time we have that supplemental architectural education, maybe some kind of work session meeting with applicants, and sometimes they get that with the informal. I think is pretty helpful. That's something that we put in a couple of years ago. But I think a lot of it's just going to be communicating the ideas and what terms are used so that people walk away with an understanding without feeling like their project has been designed for them and that their, property rights have been impaired in some way.
Sounds like a good idea. I like that. I like a work session. Learning how to cite our authority and getting a clear message across is what I'm hoping that we get really good at. I think we're good, but we can always be better.
And I mentioned this in a conversation that we had, Jane, and Lance will be familiar with this as well. This whole idea of, they teach us in law school to put together our arguments in this sort of issue, rule, analysis, conclusion framework. And as you're going through a project and giving feedback, that type of framework might just help to organize thoughts, organize the record when people go back to it, to see, what does the zoning commission actually want? Well, our issue is massing. The rule in this Bridge Street district neighborhood is X. My plan had Y, and so this is what I'm going to, have to do to reach what they've told us to do, and move through it in that very sort of logical progression.
I thought that was helpful when you talked about it. I think it would be helpful for all of us to find a way to get a logical beginning to end. Any tips you can give, I think, are helpful. I would love that.
Yeah, obviously, I would echo that completely, because concern is that it's so easy for us to impose our, personal likes and dislikes when you think about, the applicant and their property rights, and we're being, we're serving in an adjudicatory, we're being judges. We're supposed to be impartial. We're supposed to follow the rules, so to speak, and not our own personal opinions, which we all have, versus the legislative part of our job, which is more, is policy, and we can have personal opinions in that. And, we all struggle. So I think if we can develop a tighter framework that gives us some catch to say, okay, I personally don't like that, but it is fits within the parameters, and because we have a lot of discretion, I think that discipline would be great. Maybe not as much fun, but it would certainly be appropriate.
Okay, that's really helpful. And yeah, we have had those situations where we want to make sure that people are, like you said, citing the authority, not just your personal preference, right? Going back to the code, the development text, those rules that govern those private properties.
Yeah, I think the code is really useful, and I think there's a lot of things that council and the city and consultants have built into our decisions before we got here. Roof pitches and land mass and architecture and so on. That it's the old thing that I don't know what quality is, but I know it when I see it, and so I think that makes it tough. But I think that Lance said it. If you have certain guidelines. I don't think we should be judging people by our taste, but I think we should judge it based on what quality looks like and materials and the things we've already built in, like roof pitches and four-sided architecture and brick driveways and all those kind of things. I think that we've got those tools to act on when we make those decisions. So I personally like traditional over contemporary, but there's some beautiful quality looking contemporary buildings that fit in fine. So I think that it shouldn't be taste, but I think that Mark and Lance made some really good points about architecture and what we expect to get. So I think that it's tough, but I think that the better the guidelines are, the easier it is for us to make a decision, I guess. So.
Jenny and Tammy, do you think you have what you need from a goal setting perspective based on this conversation? Anything
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate everybody's time to this topic.
Great. Well, let's move on to communications then. Anything, Jenny, you would like to communicate to the team?
I don't have anything at this time unless Nikki has anything. I'll take her silence as no.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, I think that's it then. Any final comments from the commission? I think if not, we're ready to adjourn.
Did a great job, Christina.
Great job.
Thank you, Christina.
Christina,
Well,
great job. Great job.
I had a great script writer, so